Story 1. Thanksgiving was supposed to be a relaxing getaway for the Johnson family at their cabin in the woods, far from the city lights and the noise of everyday life. But this year, something, or rather someone, would make it a holiday they'd never forget. The Johnson family had been going to their secluded cabin every Thanksgiving for years. It was tradition, a chance to unplug, relax, and enjoy each other's company. This year they arrived a little later than usual, and the weather was colder, with thick fog settling around the cabin, casting an eerie, isolating atmosphere over the woods. The first night, they settled in, unpacking and chatting about past Thanksgivings. Around midnight, they all heard it, a single loud knock on the door. Startled, Mr. Johnson went to check, thinking maybe it was a stray animal or a branch. But there was no one there, just the thick fog rolling across the ground. They brushed it off as nothing. But the next night, the knocking came again, this time louder, more forceful. It was 3 distinct knocks, like someone was demanding to be let in. Mr. Johnson opened the door, but no one was there. He stepped outside, shining his flashlight through the trees, only to catch a glimpse of something moving, a shadowy figure darting between the trees. That's when they noticed the footprints. They were large and deep, leading right up to the cabin door before disappearing into the woods. Mr. Johnson assured his family it was just a hunter passing through, but his unease was clear. The tension rose as they heard movement outside throughout the night, faint footsteps circling the cabin, whispers carried by the cold November air. On Thanksgiving night after the meal, they sat down by the fire when the knocking came again. This time from every window, as if they were surrounded. The lights flickered, and Mrs. Johnson caught a glimpse of a face pressed against the glass, eyes hollow, staring right at her. She screamed, and Mr. Johnson rushed to close all the windows. They stayed up all night, waiting for dawn as the knocking persisted, moving around the cabin, never stopping. When the sun finally rose, they found the yard covered in deep footprints, but the most chilling discovery was a single note scratched onto the door. "Next Thanksgiving, let me in." They left the cabin that morning and have never returned since. Story 2. Thanksgiving travel can be stressful, with long drives, crowded roads, and endless hours on the freeway. But for one family, a simple drive to a Thanksgiving dinner turned into a nightmarish encounter that would haunt them forever. The Anderson family was heading to their relative's home for Thanksgiving, a 4-hour drive across long, deserted stretches of highway. It was late, around 11 p.m., when they noticed a figure standing by the side of the road up ahead. At first, they thought it was someone in need of help, a woman standing in the cold November night, alone on the side of the road. As they got closer, they saw that she was dressed in an old-fashioned dress, tattered and muddy, her face pale and her hair hanging in damp strands. Mr. Anderson slowed down, but something about her sent a shiver down his spine. She didn't look at the car. Instead, she was staring down at the ground, her expression unreadable. Against his better judgment, he pulled over, rolling down the window just enough to ask if she needed help. The woman didn't answer. She just looked up, her eyes empty and hollow, and then took a step toward the car, mumbling something inaudible. The family felt a collective chill, sensing that something was very wrong. Suddenly, she started screaming, an unnatural guttural scream that pierced the quiet night. Mr. Anderson floored the gas pedal, speeding away, his heart pounding. As they drove, they realized they could still hear her scream, echoing in their heads long after they left her behind. But the horror didn't end there. A few miles down the road, they noticed something unsettling. Their daughter, seated in the back seat, whispered, "Mom, she's outside my window." When they looked, they saw her again. The same woman, keeping pace with their car, her empty eyes fixed on them as she ran alongside, her face pressed against the glass. They sped away, not stopping until they reached their destination, trembling with fear. To this day, they avoid that stretch of road, haunted by the memory of the roadside stranger who seemed to be more than just a lost soul. Story 3. On Thanksgiving Day, the Richards family invited a neighbor, Mr. Harlan, to join them for dinner. He was a quiet, elderly man who lived alone down the street and rarely interacted with anyone. They thought it was a kind gesture, as he had no family of his own, and Thanksgiving was meant to be shared. At first, the dinner was pleasant enough, though Mr. Harlan was strangely silent, barely touching his food. He sat at the far end of the table, watching the family with an unsettling, almost hungry gaze. The Richards tried to include him in conversation, but he only nodded or shook his head, his eyes fixed intently on each of them in turn. As the night wore on, strange things started happening. They would hear footsteps when no one was walking, and lights would flicker whenever Mr. Harlan looked in their direction. Mrs. Richards began to feel uneasy, noticing that whenever she looked away, Mr. Harlan seemed to be closer to her than before, almost like he was drifting silently across the room. When it was time to say goodbye, Mr. Harlan refused to leave. He simply sat in his chair, staring at them with his empty, hollow eyes. Mr. Richards gently insisted, but Mr. Harlan remained unmoving, his lips curling into a strange smile. They eventually went to bed, hoping he would take the hint and leave. But when they came downstairs in the morning, he was still there, sitting at the table, staring out the window as if waiting for something. Frightened, they called the police, who arrived to find nothing. The chair where he had been sitting was empty, but a single note was left on the table. "Thank you for inviting me. I'll be back every year." Since then, the Richards have felt his presence every Thanksgiving. The lights flicker, footsteps echo, and every now and then, they hear the faint creak of a chair moving, as though Mr. Harlan has returned for his yearly visit.